Hello, and welcome to SecureTalk, a podcast where we explore the critical world of information security innovation and compliance. I'm your host, Justin Beals, founder and CEO of StrikeCraft. Together with our expert guests, we'll provide you tools and tips to help your business thrive in the rapidly evolving cybersecurity environment. Hello, everybody, and welcome to SecureTalk. We're super glad to have you joining us today. We have another amazing guest in store for us. Today, we're going to be chatting with Jason Healey. Jason is a senior research scholar at Columbia University's School for International and Public Affairs, specializing in cyber risk and conflict. He has taught and mentored hundreds of students who have gone on to careers at the White House, the finance sectors, civil society, and everywhere in between. Jason was a founding member of both the Office of the National Cyber Director at the White House in 2022 and the first cyber command in the world, the Joint Task Force for Computer Network Defense in 1998, where he was one of the early pioneers of cyber threat intelligence. He started his career as a U.S. Air Force intelligence officer with jobs at the Pentagon and the National Security Agency. Jason also founded the Incident Response and Cyber Threat Intelligence capabilities at Goldman Sachs and is a former vice chair of the FS-ISAC. Jason, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me here on SecureTalk.
That is quite the resume. I have to say in 1998, I think I was more focused on writing code and drinking beer a little bit. So it's really an amazing background. But of course, we love an origin story, and especially for our early in career listeners, they love hearing how people have pieced together these amazing journeys. Could you tell us a little bit about how you got started?
Yeah, thanks. Right. I had actually been a political scientist, but knew for my undergrad at the Air Force Academy and wanted to be a pilot, right? This was near the first Top Gun days. And as I got in, I realized at best, I'm going to be an average pilot of tanker or transport aircraft, right? I'm just like, I would get airsick, right? This isn't not going to work. But it was the decision that I said that, I'm going to compete for intelligence because I bet I can use my brain. Like I think I'm okay at thinking about stuff.
Yeah.
And I knew I loved the technology. And I see this with so many of my students now they love the technology and they love thinking about the implications of the technology and how we deal with it and the troubles that it causes on society.
Yeah.
But they're not going to be technologists themselves necessarily. And so that meant for where the choices available at the time was either going to space, not going to space, but, going, looking at space and NRO kinds of stuff or getting into cyber. And so I made that decision right around 94 that, I wanted to get in this stuff that was maybe just starting to be called cyber then. And the timing was great because the military was just starting to figure this out. Air Force captains like I was at the time happened to be well placed to help tackle a lot of these important issues, especially at the NSA and the Pentagon.
Yeah.
To start saying, all right, how does the Department of Defense as a whole start to tackle these?
I mean, certainly there was a lot happening with digital networking, sharing of information. Mm-hmm. And of course, you were around for the first time someone mentioned even something called cyber warfare or cyber security broadly, literally defining that function inside an organization as complicated as the U.S. Air Force. Yeah.
And, so if you want to talk origin stories, right? So for me, a lot of the story goes back to the mid to late 1960s.
Okay.
Not my story. I guess technically my story, but to me, I love it because it's our field. Because in the 60s, if computer security was locking the door, right, you had your perimeter was an actual perimeter, right? It was a concrete wall with a locked door, and so as long as you locked the door and you did some security for your people that were touching the computer, right, the defense would kind of have the advantage. Maybe even the defenders had the supremacy. Because your attack surface was the frickin' door.
Right.
And one of, really the founding document of computer security was this document called the Ware Report, that it was the Defense Science Board originally classified in 1970. Because we literally started to put holes in the perimeter, like literal holes, right? You had to drill a hole through the wall because you now had a network, you now had remote terminals. And so this founding document of our field said, oh crap, what do we do now that the wall isn't the barrier? Now that anyone who can touch one of these remote access terminals can get in. And basically the report said, yep, can't do it. Can't be done. Like there's no technology. There's nothing that we have that can secure this stuff. And so really since then, right, for those 50 years, to my mind, right, it's been okay, how can we defenders catch up? And then of course we did the internet, right? Then it wasn't just the people touching the remote access terminal. Now is anybody in the world can now get access because we knocked those literal holes in the perimeter in the 60s and 70s.
I can see the tension a little bit, and I'm going to own I'm not a deep expert in warfare as a practice. I don't know how to describe that well. I'm just going to own that. But I can see the tension.
Justin, you're not a cyber warrior. I thought everybody was nowadays.
Thanks, Jason. I'm the foible for these things. So I can see the tension, and I think we even see it in conflicts that are happening today where real-time intelligence information is actually much more critical to success than the number of soldiers you have on the battlefield.
To some degree, yes, right? So much of my job as a practitioner and now more as a scholar has been looking at where are we overhyping and where are we underhyping. And we've seen a lot of overhype. For example, the UK was saying, like, hey, we don't have to really buy as many tanks because we've got cyber and we've got this other high tech stuff. And we've seen this slosh back and forth, and to some degree, my own views have sloshed back and forth. I wrote this history book, sort of a military history of cyber conflict 10 years ago. And in that I was more on the, hey, we're overhyping, right? We're talking about this digital Pearl Harbor, which goes back to 1991. Winch Wartow first in testimony to Congress in 1991 talked about electronic Pearl Harbor. So writing in 2011 and saying, boy, we haven't, we're not really seeing that yet. Obviously there are some dynamics we don't understand, but now I feel like it's gone the other way. Right, we have folks that are trying to draw conclusions from Ukraine or the rest and saying, like, cyber capabilities aren't like that. They don't do the big Pearl Harbor. They're useful to steal information and to shape the information space, but not really useful on the battlefield or coercion on the rest. And they have a ton of great evidence for that.
Yeah.
But my concern is, well, all of our evidence was substantially drawn when states weren't invading each other for territorial gain. Right. You largely had, even when there were invasions like the United States in Iraq, 2003, Azerbaijan or stuff in Syria, you didn't have two technologically advanced countries and they weren't playing for existential stakes like territorial annexation, like we've seen now with Ukraine, like we're worried about with Iran, like we're worried about with China. And so maybe, states might operate differently. Cyber might be used in very different and surprising ways. And I'll just say one last, right? To me as practitioners, right? I just saw it was the anniversary of NIMDA this week. And many of your listeners will remember this hit 1 week after 9/11. And it just took down, it was another one of those worms that were hitting us every quarter back in those days. 25 years ago, 23 years ago. And they would just take down like substantial portions of the internet a couple of times a year. And so I think for those of us practitioners that lived through that, we know cyber can get a lot worse. It can cause these large scale disruptions, even though there wasn't a nation state anchoring, nation state threat actors that were conducting.
Yeah. I think, certainly we're seeing some interesting things play out with Ukraine and Russia. It feels like there's still a lot to learn, and notice about what's happening on that particular conflict. And, you and I are going to be a little safe to not get too far out over our skis in some of these discussions because there's a lot of information we don't know and is coming to light. And we'll try and
two things on that. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for raising. And one, by the way, I'm not a cyber warrior either. Like I was never on the keyboard, right? I was an incident response and intelligence guy. policy guy. I was more on the governance and risk side, like you, I think. And Ukraine is very interesting, and we're still working through those lessons and how much of it was, hard work by the Ukrainian defenders, but especially getting a ton of outside capability coming in through places like the CDAC, the Cyber Defense Assistance Coalition for Ukraine, Cyber Command, Hunt Forward, right? So how much of those lessons about what Russia was able to do, Russia wasn't really incorporating cyber. So I'm concerned that we might overlearn those lessons if, for example, China against Taiwan, right? Taiwan might not get that extraordinary external support. China, the United States, North Korea might have learned the lessons that, hey, Russia didn't do a good job integrating it, and here's how to do better next time. And so hugely thankful that Russian cyber in Ukraine wasn't as bad as we thought. Hugely thankful that it doesn't look like Putin wanted to use his cyber forces to target Europe, like European energy markets, American financial markets. So fingers crossed. Wouldn't it be great if cyber actually isn't as dangerous in the hands of the state as we might fear? I would love that, but it would surprise me a bit.
It's a very connected world, right? We keep putting more and more critical infrastructure into that, and that creates more and more surface area to secure. Yeah. You mentioned, and I think this is really intriguing to me, you're a deep expert in cybersecurity policy at a global and national level. That's a unique perspective, Jason. I'm usually concerned about a customer.
Right.
Yeah. What do you see? What do you see as some of the successes and failures in policy making around this area?
Where I've been most excited is, so much of my thinking on this, Justin, goes back to that origin story I told about, right? Yeah. Defense used to have advantage, maybe even supremacy, and then it started to shift away from that. And so my goal for, the last 10 years or so has been, hey, if we're in cyber, like our only goal, I'm kind of exaggerating that, right? If I'm an academic, I've got to speak with precision. If I'm on a podcast, I speak with excitement.
You're on a podcast, we can be excited.
Our main goal so much. What can we do to shift that, to get the defense advantage at an enterprise like you work with? Like, what can we do to make sure those defenders have the advantage at the least cost?
Yeah.
But also at the larger scale for cyberspace as a whole, right? How can we shift that back towards what they had in the 60s so that the defenders have the harder time? The defenders are the ones that have the cyber skills gap. The defenders are the one that are struggling to achieve their gains, their goals at any kind of reasonable cost. And it's the defenders that can sit back and say, oh, this is kind of easy, because what we've had for the last, since I would say maybe certainly the early 2000s, where, I'm sorry to use a sports, an American sports analogy here, but where the attackers could use their junior varsity team. I guess for folks in Europe, like there's their under 23 squad.
Right. Yeah.
And for us, we would have to use our main squad. Like we would have to use our varsity team to try and take out their lesser players.
Yeah.
And if they come at us with their varsity players, man, we've got to use our all-stars. Right. To some degree, that's what we saw with SolarWinds, right? You had this super great team with the Russian foreign intelligence. That was their varsity team. And thank goodness they tried to take on Mandiant, FireEye, because those were our all-stars. And if they hadn't gone after our all-stars, we would have had a lot more difficulty trying to take them on. And, if the attackers bring their all-stars, then, God help you. You're going to have a difficult. So I'd love to see that flipped.
Yeah.
Right. Where it takes the adversaries to use to use their varsity players, like to use their main players, to try and even take down, moderately capable cyber defenders. Wouldn't that be a lovely state of affairs? And we can do it. It's absolutely possible, and I'm firmly convinced that we can do this, and we can measure the success of it too.
Oh, measurement. That's right up my alley, Jason.
Oh, great. Yeah.
Yeah. We have had a lot of discussions about the asymmetry of the power in cyber warfare. Yeah. And one of the I use the sports metaphor a lot of times too, in talking to folks, where I'm like, look, when you're in an adversarial environment, if you're a CISO, if you store critical data and people are trying to get at it, you're going to lose some games.
Yeah.
My favorite soccer team loses some games, and it makes me sad, but it's something that comes with the territory when you have an adversarial work. If we're just doing project management, we're trying to get something released in a certain period of time. We deal with our own constructs, as opposed to someone else trying to derail us directly.
Yeah.
You believe it's possible to change this. One of the things I read in some of your work is this tension between availability versus security, and trying to balance that a little bit. Are there certain things that you think are certain broad decisions that you would make about availability, or at least how we approach it?
Where my brain goes most on that is with cloud, right? It really surprised me in how much when I was working in DC that the government folks would say the cloud is great, but blah, blah, blah. In New York, working with great CISOs like Ed Amoroso and Phil Venables, and the conversation would go, well, the cloud is great, and we haven't yet begun to see the real gains from security. Like, it's going to get even better because companies were able to substantially trade off buy down their cybersecurity risk, but in exchange, they would get vendor risk, which they didn't take care of enough. But also, all of us get concentration risk. And so I'm really curious, I'm really interested in how we play that off. And in a public policy side, right, I can live with concentration risk substantially because the cloud providers have largely been we're broadly more able to shoulder that risk. But that kind of puts us in this antitrust. Like, now we've given those that already had power, and now they have even more power. And to give another, a strong cybersecurity example of that, the biggest gains that we make in cybersecurity is not at the enterprise level. Right? Imagine we invent some amazing new security widget. We've got to buy 1 billion of them. We've got to deploy them. We've got to integrate them into the environment. We have to train people. We have to keep it up to date and patched. Even it gave us perfect security. Like, that's a lot of work that we have to do. Compare that to what happened this was work we'd done with our New York Cyber Task Force that looked at how to make a more defensible cyberspace. The number one innovation that the experts raised as that gave defenders the most advantage over attackers at the largest scale and least cost, Windows Update. Mm-hmm. But you had this technology innovation that said, all right, we're just going to automatically update and we're going to push it to you. And they combined that with a process innovation, Patch Tuesday. Mm-hmm. Right? And this is where you really see the big gains when the lowest cost innovator, in this case, originally it was Microsoft, but now it's all now it's all software vendors, does the technical innovation, and when we combine it with cool process innovations. And the other cool process innovations, after we got hit by the Morris worm in 1986, the Department of Defense said, we need a computer emergency response team. It's a process innovation. It was a new organization. After Citi got hit by Vladimir Levin for $10 million, Citibank, for $10 million in 1995, they said, we need a chief information security officer. Yeah. 1998, we said, we need information sharing and analysis centers. We need an attack framework, a cyber kill chain. Those are all ideas, organizations, and it's so cheap to do that. Look how cheap MITRE ATT&CK GRC, right? Your whole space is about these process innovation.
And it's going through a deep revolution now too, not just process innovation, but we're deep into, measuring the data exhaust of control operation.
Oh, right. Cool. Yep.
For effectiveness, which is pretty wild place to be. It's just such an immediate measurement and at a precision level, because we're down to, hey, these are the 3 pieces of data exhaust we expect out of a control operation.
Yeah. Oh, that's very cool. And can I just touch on measurement? Because there's one measurement in particular that's really useful at the enterprise level, but also is easy to aggregate up to the cyberspace as a whole measure. So I love it because it helps us look at offense-defense balance, and that's mean time to detect.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So if you're a board, if you're a CISO, right, it's a measurement that you really want. Okay, how long does it take us to detect? How long does it take us to respond? How long does it take us to contain or to kick out an adversary? That's really useful at the board level. But it's been reported by the Verizon and the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report for like a decade, aggregated. So if we're getting defense better than offense at scale, at the entire internet, we would expect to see those detection times go down. And in fact, that's what's happening. Mean time to detect has dropped over the last 10-ish years from like a couple of 100 days down to 10 or 15 days. And we have that from multiple sources, even when you subtract ransomware. Because you might argue that, hey, well, you would expect shorter detections because ransomware needs to get detected or you're not going to get paid. Mandiant looked and they pulled out ransomware and they said it's gone down even if you control for ransomware.
Yeah, and broadly, like when I worked, my first computer science gig was at British Telecom, and it was rolling out their global frame relay data network at that time. Cool. And I had it was my first professional gig in computer science, no longer just playing around on my old Mac SE. But my boss there taught me something that I will never forget. And I thought it was the worst possible way to think about what we were doing, which was, well, if we didn't get hacked this year, Justin, then maybe we can cut our budget. And if we did, then we need more budget.
Yeah. Like,
it doesn't feel like a good measurement tactic.
Yeah. If we didn't crash our car, then we should just, that's awful. But it's useful.
Every once in a while, I still see it where a CISO will get fascinated with a cybersecurity tool as opposed to a broad,
right.
Like, what am I going to measure? Right. How am I going to norm reference the outcomes here? Yeah.
And that's what I love about these measurement aspects of saying, all right, like that's actually, I said that's awful. It's a terrible metric, but I get why it's a useful metric.
Yeah.
And so that's our job as practitioners, or for me now on the, as more of a scholar or public policy, as a policymaker, to say, all right, that's a useful heuristic for them to reach for. Let's make sure they've got better ones that are close to hand that make sense to them.
Yeah.
And at the White House level, right, we never had useful measurements because we never had the president or other senior policymaker give us a goal that was measurable. Mm-hmm. So our work on this New York Cyber Task Force that said, no, the goal is defensibility. The goal is shifting from offense to defense. And the White House picked that up, right? They included that in the strategy, and that gives us a measurable goal.
Yeah.
Now we can say, all right, other than mean time to detect, what are these other measurements that we can go into that's going to help us? And that's a subset of the total set of metrics. Like a lot of the metrics that are out there, how many attacks get blocked, right? Well, that's not useful. Others are really useful, but they don't have a time series. So we've been going through at Columbia. This was my talk at Black Hat to say, all right, what metrics, especially existing, I tend to call them indicators, not metrics, because there's no method. Mm-hmm. There might not be as much methodology. Do we have over time that can show us whether or not cyberspace as a whole is getting better? What ought we look for next that can help us know, for example, are we disrupting adversaries at scale?
Yeah. Do you think that part of that desire to get more precision in analyzing our ability to, deliver on good security is why we're seeing the metastasis, what I call a metastasizing set of like different standards from some are private, some are coming from NIST. We just had the 2.0 of the CSF standard, and a lot of them are really similar. But, as a software engineer, I never wanted to build any project without a framework definition, right?
Right.
It seems like we're leaned in, I think, as at least in the United States from a private market, capital markets perspective, into saying, we need to norm reference practices at least and test ourselves against those.
Yeah, and I'm hopeful by what I've seen in the U.S. out of the federal government on trying to harmonize these, right? So we're seeing, the good news is we're seeing framework. The bad news is we're seeing too many frameworks, right? So it's been nice to see the White House. A lot of your listeners might not know the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, has been sharing a cybersecurity forum of independent and executive branch regulators. So this is getting the FCC, the SEC, all these CISA, all of these regulators together to see how they can better harmonize. The White House has been driving this out of the Office of the National Cyber Director. There's a great bill that's come out of the Senate on this. That's saying, good, we've got to harmonize. Not just we have to, but that calls for there to be a committee run by the White House that's going to help bring some more coherence to all these frameworks so that we don't have CPGs and CSFs and NISTs and what have you, that they're going to should be much more harmonized. So fingers crossed. I'm optimistic.
Yeah. I went through this in a different vertical in education. In K-12 in education, everything is standards driven, right?
Yeah.
And it's a huge set of standards, 50 states times 8 different subject areas times 12 different grade levels. And you have to take everything from like quiz questions to lesson plans to, and then we have standardized testing. So there is some really wonky measurement tools on the assessment side. And it turned into a really huge computer science problem. It was essentially a data ontology and graphing issue at the end of the day. Yeah. You mentioned policies. You worked on the 2023.
Can I just say that for a second? And that's one reason why I'm especially when I'm looking at my indicators, looking for what we're already capturing.
Yeah.
Right. Like, when I talk about this, people say, oh, wow, that's going to be a big data set. I don't want the data set. Like Verizon's reporting this. Mandiant is reporting this. Veracode is reporting this. Right. We've got an amazing set of stuff that we can just look because at the end of the day, we don't care whether like cybersecurity has gone from 71.6 to 78.2, whatever that means. We want to know it's getting like, what's the direction and magnitude of the change, right? Like, are students doing better or are students doing worse, and at what rate? Yeah, if we could dive in, like at an enterprise, you don't want that. Like a CISO wants to see under the hood, but to a large degree, for a lot of this stuff, we don't need to see under the hood. We just need to see if 3 sources are all reporting it's going in the same direction, then we can give ourselves a thumbs up or thumbs down. I'm sorry, I talked over you there, Justin.
No, that's great because it is about the trend lines, right? More than anything else. And it's funny, we think of a lot of the data that we read, just mathematical information, let alone the standards, outcomes, and assessments as being valid in the point of time. And I'm not necessarily sure that's always true, right? It's more valid from a comparative perspective in where we were and where we're going. Yeah. So, you worked on the 2023 National Cybersecurity Policy. I think I'm always interested in how the sausage is made, but I'm an engineer by trade.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about how it's such a massive constituency. Yeah. How do you the people part of this? How does an organization manage the people part, competing priorities, what people want to see? Yeah.
So this was the White House's 2023 National Cybersecurity Strategy. It was run from the Office of the National Cyber Director, from my colleague Rob Kanaki, and the principal drafters Matt Farah and Harry Kresa. So I was associated with that team, and it was in part driven by the ideas that we had done at Columbia. One reason I was brought in. And it's really because as long as you're just working on the internal draft, it can be, it's a work of love. It's like all the things that you want to see going in this. As soon as you start submitting the draft, then it's emotion. Like then now you've got all of these departments and agencies that say, oh, wait a minute, you're calling out their program, but you're not calling out mine. And then it just starts to balloon. And so what happens with these is there's a lot of homework at the front end. Okay. So some of the homework is saying, all right, what has been the smart stuff that's been written by academia, by think tanks, by trade associations that have come in and that we want to look at, that they've said, here's what's wrong and here are the potential solutions. For this team coming in for the White House, they had the advantage of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. But Executive Director Mark, who's now at FDD, who did it, they did a great job. The National Cyber Director himself, Chris Inglis, had been one of those commissioners. So they had this great model of this good set of ideas to tackle, but they also pulled from a lot of other places, again, including our Columbia work. Then they're the official documents or unofficial documents. Okay, so what did the president campaign on? What did they say? Clearly, this was an administration that believed in the positive power of government. So it's no surprise that we saw words like market failure and regulation in there, more than another administration did. But it goes beyond that. It's like, okay, what was in the national security strategy, which talked about we have a decisive decade here, right? It talks about, talked about China or Russia in different ways. And so that has to get, those top level documents then have to get ingested and developed as part of this. Also, this team had to deal with colonial pipelines, SolarWind, right? Of these areas of saying, okay, we had these major incidents, and especially for the senior folks, right? For the Jake Sullivans, for the other folks that in their first months didn't think they'd have to be dealing with cyber and had to deal with cyber, like that leaves scars, right? For them to say, all right, yes, I'm maybe willing to be more risk seeking in this, or alternately risk averse, depending on the incident that happened. So all of that comes in, as well as the personalities and things that the drafting team themselves want. So, for example, Rob Kanaki, who is the deputy that was in charge of it, was really interested in topics like an insurance backstop for catastrophic cyber losses. There was a big push that the sector risk management agencies needed to do more. Mm-hmm. And so the team does that. And the last I'll say, before it goes out for the coordination and all of the horse trading, is people shouldn't underestimate effective and even beautiful writing. Yeah. Right? Because a lot of the stuff that went into it, the drafting team, especially Harry and Matt, were really making sound arguments with good language. It's kind of like if you see someone else's elegant code and you go, oh, wow, what a great hack. Like, what a great way of expressing this. And it helps make you feel it's right because it just looks elegant. And the way that they were able to lay out the arguments in really nice language just really helps convince people that, okay, I can get behind these ideas because this is nicely done.
Yeah. I think there's a sense of craftsmanship, right, to pulling together effective communication. And it's really, I've worked on consensus-based projects in the past where we had to get a lot of opinions and try to boil them in. And what you find interesting is that you take in a lot of data, you kind of like, I almost call it, I let it rest in my head. Right. I try to find out what the fundamental thing is everybody is trying to say and reflect that. Yeah. And it breeds some opportunity for some precision in the language itself, how we state it, where people can hear themselves and what their concerns are, but it also is encapsulated enough that they can share it. Yeah. Because it's too complicated, then they can't use the pithy phrase to remind each other of the thing we're trying to do. Yeah.
Yeah, I really like that. Yeah. And, just having the right handle of what you call something helped. There had been quite a bit on liability for software manufacturers in early drafts, and they switched that. It switched from being liability, like we're going to hold you responsible if something goes wrong, to having safe harbors if you're doing the right stuff. It's the same coin, but it's a much better way of thinking about it. The last two things let me mention is one, there was a lot of outreach. The team did hundreds of outreach, of talking to folks. I'm normally the person that connects policy to hackers, both White House, and I'm on the Black Hat and DEF CON review boards. And one day I was just walking around the compound in the White House, and I see all these, my blue hair friends, with all the stickers on their laptops. And because there had been an outreach with hackers and DEF CON and other communities, and I didn't even know about it, which was amazing because it was doing that outreach. The last I'll say is people shouldn't overlook the role of budget. It can be easy for folks with a technology background to talk down the people in DC that are doing White House policy or policy at these high levels, and they don't come from a computer science background. But one of the big things that made this strategy a success was that the inclusion of folks like Drennan Dudley and her team. She was running budget. She used to run she used to be on Senate appropriations. She had been Office of Management and Budget. So she was there to help make sure that as the strategy was being written, that there was going to be budget for these priorities, more budget for these priorities and less budget for things that weren't. And so in the previous versions, the White House, the National Security Council would have maybe 6 people total working defense. So they would do the strategy and then they'd think about implementation and budget. Because the National Cyber Director had 70, 80 people, they were able to do that and make sure that the money was included at the same time as the ideas. And that makes a huge, huge difference.
It comes back to the language issue too, right? Like if we imbue this with jargon and emotionally charged words, it makes it hard for people to think about, I can be a positive part of implementing this policy.
Right.
And also, they don't look, the more we make people feel stupid, the less they're going to want to get involved in solving the problem, right? Yeah. That's true in little, small 5-person engineering teams and at a national policy level. Something was new.
And to some degree, that's why we're seeing the change in CISOs, right? Where now CISOs are having an upward, having much more upward responsibility of and outward. They need to understand the business units and the concerns of the board because they need to be those stereotypes. They need the narrative. They need to be able to do that translation. So I'm really glad that you mentioned it that way. I think that's exactly comparable.
That's been true throughout my computer science career, right? Like there was a time where I loved like, what package are we doing and how do I do this code? And here's some interesting ways to play with data science. But my job, even before becoming a CEO as a chief technology officer, was a lot about telling stories about architecture in ways that people could understand what the opportunities were like. And we need to communicate with our business folks to help them understand the opportunity, the value, and also so often, and I impress this upon my engineers at our team, you are innovation drivers. If you are also aware of what the business is going through and can think about how technology can solve a problem in ways they never considered. Yeah.
Very cool.
One of the things that was, I have a quote from, I believe, one of your blog posts or a paper that you wrote. And you state that about the old cybersecurity policies versus the most recent one is that the lack of mandatory requirements has resulted in an inadequate and inconsistent outcomes. And I think we're talking here about the private sector a little bit. And that the new policy really, did push that forward some, where, look, those of us in the private sector need to understand what we are responsible for and the ethics around effective practices. Yeah.
And the flip side, right? One of the big things of the new strategy was saying, hey, we can no longer put the burden on the end users, right? Whether that end user is a big bank or a small and medium-sized enterprise, right? We can't keep having these national security impact because somebody clicks on a link.
Yeah.
Right. And so those who have more burden have more power should take on more responsibility. Right, whether that's the big platforms, but also the U.S. government. And the U.S. government needs to do a better job. So Rob Kanaki, the deputy who I said was responsible for the draft, he used to call it the Home Depot doctrine. You can do it, we can help, which I thought was a really interesting way of doing it. So not just regulating, but also making sure that the government is stepping up on their side.
I certainly always love when somebody tells me this is the bar you need to meet. It gives me a goal to go for. Well, I wanted to cover a couple of recent actual hacks or issues that we've had in the marketplace, security issues. One of the things that, especially in reading some of your material, I think about the CrowdStrike issue was this example of monoculture, But the other thing about the CrowdStrike issue is, do you consider it a security issue? It wasn't like a threat actor. I don't believe, from the data I've read, that some threat actor caused an issue as much as we didn't test our code very well before we released it.
Yeah, certainly it's security and resilience interwound in that, and it's one of those that I use an example because, again, having the background that I did, right? We're so stamped on our background. And so having gone through that stuff 25 years ago where the internet would routinely go down because we had common mode vulnerabilities, right? Because we had huge parts of the internet that were relying on some component, and in every other kind of conflict or crime, right? If you want to hit 1 million targets, you need 1 million cars, you need 1 million getaway cars, right? or you need to go and hit all 1 million. And as we learned with CrowdStrike, with so many of these other incidents, SolarWinds and the rest, if we're all dependent on the same, if the technology that has the same vulnerability, we can all go down at once. And so to me, this is a big component of this offense advantage. Dan Geer said it best, as he said it best for so many things, is the more technological a society becomes, the more it depends on distant digital perfection. Mm-hmm. What a great quote, that we're relying on distant digital perfection. And part of that can be looking at, these common mode vulnerabilities like CrowdStrike or the rest, where we're all dependent on the same technology. But it goes well beyond that, right? I mean, it goes to our concentration risk with the cloud providers. It goes into components, right? It's very fractal. Whatever level we get at, we just have this complexity that we can't get our heads around, where, some chip component manufacturer goes out of business or has a fire, and it cascades through the systems.
The other thing that I feel about the CrowdStrike issue was, I think in some ways, especially in the cybersecurity product world, we've gone hard at this agent modality of deploying our tools. And I feel like we've abandoned some of the best practices around network segmentation, where we have interfaces that we control who gets access to what.
Great point. Yep. Great.
Yeah. And then the other issue and this is of course emerging, but and so we'll just focus on the things that we know today. But obviously this attack on Hezbollah with Mossad is a real intelligence issue. Any thoughts that you have on how that's emerging?
Yeah, it's still early days. So as we're recording this, we've only had a couple of days of information.
Yes.
And it's been interesting. So one, I'm cautious about saying too much because I'm not an expert on many of these issues. But I suspect, like many of us in our field, we were thrown into the conversation of knowing more about this than many of the people we were around, right? Whether it's at a family gathering or, for me at Columbia University, right? I'm not an expert in explosives, but I probably know more about supply chain attacks and certainly cyber than many of the other faculty, right? And so, I suspect many of us were thrust into this place of having to say, and for me, it was, well, I doubt this is cyber, because it seems really, really hard to pull that off. But we do have to be cautious in our field, right? Of where is that right point between, all right, we need to step up and say what we think we know to those, people that aren't going to have a chance to talk to an IED expert or an EOD expert. Because we saw, a lot of people that were showing up on main news sources that was saying this was a cyber attack, that this was 0 day, this was a 0 day. And when we didn't have anywhere near that kind of understanding within the first day or two, and, without admitting the other possibilities. So, it does put us semi-experts in that tough position of needing to help de-hype, but without, making things worse.
It certainly ran over a network of some sort. But I do think my take just a couple of days in is that something about the supply chain of these physical devices is probably more critical, a concern.
Yeah. And I think it helps us a lot. But, where we as a field can help is, many of the folks that are looking at supply chain as a normal issue, like the logistics specialists that are figuring out how to get stuff that we need from place A to place B, don't think about how that gear could be, dorked in transit.
Yeah.
And we've got the security mindset, folks like us, right? Even if you're doing, I don't mean even if, right? You could take someone that's just doing software security, and that mindset of how something might happen to that software, if they know a little bit about logistics, their mind is going to be able to walk through that process of saying, like any process, give us a process and we'll walk through where are the vulnerabilities, where someone might be able to gain access to it. And so I think as we go forward, right, as there's going to be more attention now on hardware supply chains, right? Good, we've got SBOMs and the rest to start thinking in a more disciplined process about software. Now, some of that same thinking that we're good at of how can this happen, of people tampering with the physical supply chain, right? I suspect a lot of the listeners and a lot of the people that have been coming from the cyber backgrounds are going to find themselves leaning over towards that space just because we've got a good mindset for it.
Yeah. Jason, it is such a treat to get to talk to experts like yourself. This has been an amazing discussion. I always learn from it. I'm grateful for your work, both with the U.S. Air Force, National Security Agency, and our government in developing, helping us in the field that are trying to implement good security do the best that we can. And thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot, Justin. Thanks to the team from SecureTalk.